Have you heard that the Democrat and Republican parties switched, but you wanted to convince your skeptical family and friends that that happened? Well, stick around because I'm going to give you 3 convincing arguments that would do just that. And we're starting right now. Hi, I'm Kyle, and this is part 1 of my Walkaway series where I hope to give you the tools to help your rational and open-minded friends to also walk away. In this video, I'm going to show you 3 convincing arguments that, if answered honestly, will help your friends do the same thing. If you look on the show notes below, I'm going to give you all the references and the outline for this video. I'm also going to index each point so that you can come back at a later time to reference. Let's begin. For the claim that the parties at some point in time switched, we have to come to some reasonable arguments. These 3 questions are something that you ask the person who has the objection. Each question will be a question to them, allowing them to go through the rationale of what they're about to learn. This is very important. The first argument in the form of a question would be, when did white Southerners who used to vote Democrat start to vote Republican? The second question is, when did blacks who used to vote Republican start to vote Democrat? The third question is, when did the core values of each party switch? Because really, that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about the change of the value system from one party to the other. So right now, we're going to have to walk them through each step, okay? And we're going to do this one at a time. So for the first topic, when did white Southerners who used to vote Democrat start to vote Republican? The fact of the matter is that white Southerners began to vote Republican in the 70s and 80s. Surprised? In a book by Shafer called The End of Southern Exceptionalism, he outlines all of this. I have a link to that book below. So what he found was that as racism in the South declined, the identification to the Republican Party increased. He found that the least racist Southerners became Republicans. The most racist Southerners stayed Democrats. So as the South became less agrarian or rural, whites started to identify with the Republican appeal for upward mobility, free market, prosperity, and equal opportunity. The second question we're going to tackle is, when did blacks who used to vote Republican start to vote Democrat? So to argue that the party switched, you would have to argue that blacks changed parties sometime after the 60s. But the fact of the matter is that blacks turned from the Republican Party in the 1930s. So you may want to offer up this, that people vote their own self-interests. So it's reasonable to think that Democrats today are voting for what they feel is their best interest. For the third point here, what are the core values of each party and when did they actually switch? Okay, so if your friend or your family member has gotten this far for those first 2 points, that's a good sign. But the fact of the matter is, in their mind, they're probably thinking, you know what, well, we're the party of civil rights. We have evolved. We've gotten past those archaic ideas. So the plan here is to give a contrast between the Democrat Party and the Republican Party then and now. We're going to take past evidence and we're going to marry that with contemporary evidence, and we're going to build a narrative that makes sense to them, because what they see today is going to be very similar in concept and philosophy to what was going on before. And that's how we're going to do this. So let's go through a few points. Lyndon Johnson, who's a Democrat, passed the 1964 Civil Rights Act. But who voted for it? In the House of Representatives, the GOP supported the Civil Rights Act at 82%, to Democrat 61%. In the Senate, the GOP supported the '64 Civil Rights Act 82% to Democrats 69%. Who are some of the key Democrats who voted against the '64 Civil Rights Act? Well, for one, we have Al Gore Sr., who was Bill Clinton's mentor. He was also a racist. He voted against the '64 Civil Rights Act. A gentleman by the name of William Fulbright, who Bill Clinton gave the Medal of Freedom to, and was one of 19 Democrat senators who signed the Southern Manifesto, which advocated segregation. And of course, we can't forget Robert Byrd, the Grand Dragon of the KKK, who also became a majority leader in the Senate. He also voted against the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So now we come to an important figure, Barry Goldwater. Democrats love to bring him up because he was against the 1964 Civil Rights Act as well. But what they don't tell you is that he was strongly in favor of the 1957 and 1960 versions of the Civil Rights Act, which just so happened the Democrats also were totally opposed to. So who was Barry Goldwater? He was a founding member of his chapter in Arizona of the NAACP. He pushed to desegregate the Arizona National Guard. And so when we get back to the 1964 Act, why did he disagree with it? Because he had fundamental constitutional problems against it. It wasn't because it was racist, it was because the issues he had were just unconstitutional. Barry Goldwater was not a racist. Still don't believe me? Well, a gentleman by the name of Martin Luther King Sr. was a very strong Barry Goldwater supporter. Let's talk about the big switch. This is what they talk about where at some point in time, the Democrats became Republicans and the Republicans became Democrats. Well, what is that all about? After 1964, there was only one senator that left the Democrat Party to become a Republican. You probably know him. His name is Strom Thurmond. So who was Strom Thurmond? And was he by himself? Was it just that one senator or was there others? In Dinesh D'Souza's movie, Hillary's America, he goes through this in great detail. From the research that Dinesh uncovered, he found that if you go from the year 1860 to the year 2000, if you take all of the leaders from the Ku Klux Klan, all of the leaders from the other racist organizations of the time, all of the Democrat senators and congressmen at the state house and at the congressional level, and if you take every person that voted against the 1964 Civil Rights Act, he found that less than 1% left the Democrat Party and became Republican. Over 1,600 people who were Democrats, who were racist, only 8 left to become Republican. The rest all stayed Democrats to the day they died. So now I'm going to go through a quick lightning round of information that's well documented that if they aren't on board yet will make it very difficult by the time I'm finished. The majority of Black Americans were voting Democrat by the 1940s, not the 50s, and surely not the 60s. In fact, Truman won the Black vote by 80% in 1948. So in 1932, an important man by the name of Robert Vann, who was the publisher of the Pittsburgh Courier, led the charge for realignment. He wrote articles encouraging Blacks to leave the Republican Party and start to vote for Democrats. He urged his readers, my friends, it's time to turn Lincoln's picture to the wall. The last Republican presidential candidate to win the Black vote was Herbert Hoover. In fact, in the 1930s, the Black vote for the Democrat Party went from 15% to a whopping 70% in 4 years. So it was the New Deal, the benefits of the New Deal under FDR that drove Blacks into the Democrat Party. As Dinesh D'Souza mentions, it was a Faustian deal, meaning that they traded benefits, economic benefits, for being in bed with the racists. They left the party of abolition. They left the party of Lincoln. They left the party of Frederick Douglass to go sit in bed with the party of the Dixiecrats and the Ku Klux Klan. You may have heard of the decision Brown versus the Board of Education, where schools were desegregated. Well, the last obstructionist to that was a gentleman by the name of Fred Vinson. He just happened to be the Supreme Court Chief Justice, and he was also the last Chief Justice appointed by a Democrat. President Eisenhower backed the Civil Rights Bill. In fact, his Congress was the author of it. He federalized the National Guard to go to Little Rock Central High School to protect the citizens there. The Deep South did not abandon the Democrat Party after 1964. In fact, the Republicans didn't gain a majority of Southern congressional seats until the election of 1994, 30 years later. Look, if the new civil rights Southern voters were actually racist, one could presume that these voters came from Southern rural areas. But that's not the case. In a book by Gerald Alexander called The Myth of the Racist Republicans, he documents this. He finds that Republicans didn't come from rural areas. They were coming from the suburbs and from the cities. Like we said before, they were looking for upward mobility and they were looking for prosperity and equal opportunity. They didn't come from Mississippi, Georgia, or Alabama. It started in states like Virginia, to North Carolina, to Tennessee, to Florida. Eisenhower did better in the peripheral states. In this book, Alexander says, in sum, the GOP's Southern electorate was not rural, nativist, less educated, or afraid of change, or concentrated in the most stagnant parts of the Deep South. It was disproportionately suburban, middle class, educated, younger, non-native Southern, and concentrated in the growth points that were, so to speak, the least Southern parts of the South. So what Alexander is saying is, like we said before, as the South became less racist, it became more Republican. So what we're finding is that by the 1960s, all the progress that had been made up to that point were either stalled or reversed entirely. In other words, the first half of the 20th century, we saw progress. In the second half of the 20th century, we saw decline. So that was then. Let's look at some contemporary arguments. And here, by this time, we would have put so much on them. Let's just throw some more questions back at them, and hopefully things will start to make sense. So what we're trying to do is get them to decide what are the core values of each party and let them determine in their own mind if they actually switched. So the first question I ask them at this point, which party today supports high taxes and high regulations, which squash minority upstarts and entrepreneurs? Which party supports a government monopoly on education that forces parents to send their children to schools that underperform or are dangerous? Which party do you think acts condescending towards blacks in the fact that they feel that they need special help or special treatment or special set-asides because they just can't do it themselves? They need our help. And which party has had influence and control in every single major ghetto in this country for the past 60 years? And nothing since then has seemed to improve. So at this point, here's the fun part. You simply just walk away. You presented them the evidence, you gave them the questions, and you ended on questions. And so for them, it's on them. You can point them to this video, you can point them to their references, and that's all you can do. And so if they can answer these questions honestly, they are in a good position to also walk away. Okay, that's it. That's part one. In part two, we're going to talk about the Dred Scott case and how that affected the the civil rights movement and where we are today. So, comment below, like and subscribe, and let me know what you think, and try to stay civil in the chat, okay? And don't forget the references in the show notes. Also in the description, you'll find a playlist for all of the Walkaway series that you may have missed. So until next time, remember, learning from the past helps us to relate to the future. Until next time.